I'm Nathan Rutherford, and welcome to Myth Madness. This season of Myth Madness focuses on the Greek heroes. We think of heroes in myth as going on adventures. They might fight a serpent, rescue a princess, or found a city. They have strength and courage and use these things to overcome obstacles and come to the end of their adventure. They are larger-than-life figures. Many of them are the children of gods and goddesses. We sometimes assume these heroes are good guys, knights in shining armor, morally impeccable, or just honest and honorable. But that is not always the case. A lot of heroes, especially Greek heroes, also do a lot of things that are not heroic. Raping, killing impulsively, rushing into combat. These heroes fight for honor and glory, which is not necessarily the same thing as what we think of as good today. Tricksters are a little different. They can be great warriors like a lot of other heroes, but the real mark of a trickster is this. Instead of relying mostly on strength and courage, their strength, for lack of a better word, is their cleverness, cunning, or guile. And like the other heroes, tricksters are not always very heroic. They often use lies and tricks to get what they want. In many mythologies from around the world, tricksters have big roles to play. In North America, there is Coyote. In Africa, there is Eshu. In Polynesia, we have Maui. In Europe, Loki. There are many, many more, but those are some of my favorites. These tricksters have many stories about them and were very important figures in their cultures. These four, Coyote, Eshu, Maui, and Loki, are also considered gods or spirits, so they are not really in the same category as human heroes. But what about in Greek mythology? Where are the tricksters here? From a quick glance, you might think they're missing, but if you look closer, some Greek tricksters do begin to show themselves. In my first series on Greek mythology, I talked about Prometheus and Hermes. You can go back to their episodes to get the full story. But essentially, Prometheus used a variety of tricks to make life easier for human beings, giving us fire, for instance. And Hermes, while he was just a baby, was able to steal Apollo's herd of cows. Personally, I think in Hermes' case, there was probably other myths about his antics, lies, and trickery, but they are lost. Maybe because later Greek writers were not as interested in those stories when compared to the more physical exploits of brave heroes on the hunt for glory. Nevertheless, though, there are some Greek human heroes who also look like tricksters too. One famous one, Odysseus, I will talk about at some later time. This episode will cover two Greek tricksters named Sisyphus and Autolycus, who appear early in my chronology of heroes, and who have some stories that intertwine with each other. Sisyphus was not a direct son of one of the Olympian gods, but he did have an interesting genealogy, going back to the survivors of a flood that wiped out most of mankind. Deucalion was the man who survived the Greek flood myth. Zeus, the king of the universe, decided he'd had enough of humans and tried to exterminate them with water. Deucalion survived and was considered the ancestor of all currently existing human beings, because the world was repopulated by his family after the flood. The ancient Greeks believed Deucalion's various sons and grandsons traveled to different parts of the world and founded different populations of people. One of the sons was Hellene, who was considered the legendary ancestor of all the Hellenic Greeks. The myth surrounding Hellene and his other human ancestor brothers get pretty murky. In some cases it's hinted that Hellene may not be completely the son of Deucalion, and that he is actually a son of Zeus. We can say that Hellene had three sons: Doris, Xuthos, and Aeolus. Each of them was believed to be a legendary ancestor to the Greeks, each being the founder of an early tribe of Greek people, all descended from the original flood survivor, Deucalion. Hellene's son Doris was the founder of the Dorian Greeks. Xuthos was the ancestor of the Achaeans and Ionians, and Aeolus was the founder of the Aeolians. Who were these four tribes in reality? In the classical period, Greek people divided themselves into four groups. It seems this was based on differences in spoken language and possibly reflected an actual historical separation. But that's not completely clear. Homer in the Odyssey seems to use the word Achaeans as a catch-all term for all Greeks. The use of these terms was probably fluid over the course of ancient Greek history. But essentially what's happening here is each generation of Deucalion's descendants was considered the legendary founder of more and more specific groups of people. The myth of Hellene and his sons was used to explain where all the different Greek people came from. So stemming from Deucalion, you have the ancestors of all surviving human beings. From his son Hellene, you have the ancestors of the Greeks, and so on and so forth. Hellene's sons, Aeolus, Doris, and Xuthos, had multiple children, who were in turn the mythical founders of several Greek regions, cities, and kingdoms. One of Aeolus's sons was Sisyphus. Apollodorus's library lists 6 others: Cretheus, Athamas, Salmoneus, Deion, Magnes, and Perieres. Sisyphus is the main trickster of today's episode, and was the legendary founder of the city-state of Ephyria. Ephyria is a name you may not recognize. The city-state founded by Sisyphus is best known by its other name, Corinth. History is full of founders for kingdoms, countries, and empires. Oftentimes these people are revered and beloved by their descendants, and many times they're hated by other groups of people. If you're a founder in a chaotic time, you probably aren't going to be a particularly peaceful person. You may have to resort to force, deceit, be unbending, and maybe just an overall jerk to manage your kingdom. But if the kingdom lasts after your death, and doesn't collapse into a bunch of sniveling, divided factions, your followers would say you did something right. Sisyphus is really no different. He was a good king, an effective one, but he was also a bad man, a crafty, deceitful schemer. Homer called him the most cunning of men in the Iliad. Sisyphus often killed guests and other travelers who came to visit his palace, breaking Zeus's treasured rules that governed hospitality. Nothing was sacred to King Sisyphus if it got him what he wanted. Sisyphus and his brother Salmoneus hated each other. Salmoneus was another legendary founder king. Why they hated each other is not clear. They probably both wanted to take over the kingdom belonging to the other. Sisyphus went to an oracle to understand how he could have his brother killed. The answer being that if he seduced his brother's daughter and got her pregnant, their son would kill Salmoneus. The daughter in question was Tyro. She was also the mother of several other Greek heroes, so I will come back to her again in other episodes. Sisyphus was successful in seducing her, and they did have a son. But Salmoneus was saved from Sisyphus's plot. Tyro found out about the oracle's prophecy and saved her father by killing her own son with Sisyphus. As it happened, Salmoneus later met his end anyway. Like Sisyphus, he was not a good guy either, and was particularly offensive towards Zeus. According to Apollodorus, Salmoneus was arrogant and made his subjects worship him alongside the king of the universe. He even made himself look like Zeus, and took the god's sacrifices for himself. He impersonated Zeus by riding in a chariot and dragging hides and bronze kettles behind him. The noise was supposed to be his thunder. He threw torches into the air as he rode, and he claimed that they were lightning. Zeus responded by striking him with a thunderbolt and wiping out the city Salmoneus founded with all of its inhabitants. Harsh. With Salmoneus' city blasted from the face of the earth, Sisyphus remained king in Corinth. He married Meriope, a nymph who was a daughter of the Titan Atlas. Their children were Glaucus, Ornithion, Almus, and Thersander. But let's for a moment leave King Sisyphus in Corinth and talk about this episode's other trickster, Autolycus. Unlike Sisyphus, but like a lot of important Greek heroes, Autolycus was the son of one of the Olympian gods. His story starts with a woman named Chione, who was the daughter of a man named Daedalon, and who lived on Mount Parnassus in Phocis, Greece. Her story is recorded by Hyginus and Ovid, and their versions are mostly consistent. Chione was very beautiful, and naturally many suitors came to see her, and she got the attention of some gods as well. First, there was Hermes. Ovid describes how Hermes used his wand to put the girl into a trance, and in that way he had sex with her and she suffered his assault. Later, Apollo changed into the form of an old woman, and somehow, in that disguise, was able to take advantage of Chione and sleep with her too. Hyginus says the same, but less detailed, just that Apollo and Hermes both slept with Chione on the same night. Chione grew pregnant with the children of both gods. They were twins, and at the end of her pregnancy she gave birth to Philemon, who was the son of Apollo, and Autolycus, who was the son of Hermes. But Chione was not able to raise these two boys to adulthood. Both Ovid and Hyginus talk about how Chione offended the goddess Artemis, and paid a terrible price for it. Chione claimed she was better than Artemis, and the goddess responded by shooting her with an arrow. Ovid describes this with an extra gory detail, saying Artemis shot the arrow, and it stuck right into Chione's tongue, and the woman then bled to death. Afterwards, Ovid describes how Chione's father was so upset he ran away in a frenzy, faster and faster, until he reached the edge of Mount Parnassus and then dove off a cliff. But other sources also add that Apollo took pity on the man and turned him into a hawk before he fell to the ground. There is another slightly different version. Pausanias says that while Autolycus was the son of Hermes, his true father was Daedalon. I'm not sure exactly what this means. It could mean Autolycus had two fathers, an immortal one, Hermes, and a mortal one, Daedalon. It could also mean that Daedalon, at least in this version, is not Chione's father, but instead possibly her husband. Pausanias likely means that Autolycus's true father was the man who raised him, his adopted father, and this could still be technically his grandfather. This kind of arrangement where a hero can have two fathers, one being immortal and largely absent, and the other a human who raises them from childhood, is fairly common in Greek myth. In future episodes, we'll see this situation again and again. Anyways, two different gods got Chione pregnant, and these two twin sons took after their fathers. Philemon became a talented musician, famed for his songs and skills with the lyre. Autolycus was wily, adept at tricks of every kind, and a son who had his father Hermes' skills. Hyginus says that Hermes granted his son some special powers, that he trained him to be a skilled thief, and gave him the ability to change whatever he stole into some other, less suspicious form. This same idea also goes back centuries to Homer's Odyssey. The 8th century BC poem says that Autolycus was trained in thievery from the god Hermes himself, who welcomed his many sacrifices of lambs and young goats, and who gladly seconded his actions. To get the first connection between Sisyphus and Autolycus, we have to now talk about another legendary Greek king, who also shows some trickster-like qualities. King Erysichthon of Thessaly was another descendant of Aeolus, just like Sisyphus. How exactly varies between sources. He may have been the son of one of Aeolus's daughters. Erysichthon was one of those Greek kings that did not endear himself to the gods and goddesses of Olympus. The Olympian he offended was Demeter. The Hellenistic Greek poet Callimachus and the Romans Ovid and Hyginus all record variations of this story, and there are other fragmentary sources that hint at slightly different versions too. Callimachus' version is the oldest of the three, from around 270 BC. In the hymn, the king gathered 20 of his best men, armed them with axes, and went to a grove sacred to Demeter. Erysichthon ordered that the trees be cut down so he could use them to create a great banquet hall. Demeter appeared in the form of a priestess, to warn him not to. When he refused and began chopping, she showed herself to be a goddess by growing in size, and then set out to curse him with a terrible hunger. As much as he ate, so much did he desire again. His family became so ashamed they actually stopped sending him to other people's banquets, and told people that he was not at home and could not accept invitations. Within the house, though, he ate, and also began to waste away. Eventually he was cast out, to lie like a beggar at crossroads and begging for scraps. Hyginus calls Erysichthon Triopas in his version. In other sources, Triopas is actually his father's name. Nevertheless, Hyginus' account gives broad strokes similar to Callimachus, but also has key differences too. He says the king tore down Demeter's temple in order to use its wood to build a roof on his own palace. His punishment is a curse from Demeter to keep him hungry and never satisfied by any amount of food. Hyginus also mentions something else, that a snake was sent to torment the king too. While Ovid lived around the time of Hyginus, his version is still more similar to Callimachus's one from the earlier Hellenistic period. Again, we have Erysichthon marching into the sacred grove of Demeter and attempting to cut down its trees, specifically a great big oak tree that was decorated with ribbons and tablets covered with prayers to the goddess. His men hesitated, and so the king tried to cut down the tree himself. But where he cut the tree, sap did not ooze out. Instead, the wound flowed with red blood. The spirit of the tree prophesied that the king would pay, but he proceeded to cut it down anyway. What did Demeter do? She found a famine monster and sent it to the house of Erysichthon. The spirit held the king while he slept, breathed its foul breath on him, and spread the curse of hunger in his aching veins. When he awoke, he demanded all the foods of the sea, earth, and air. The non-stop food could not satisfy him. Eventually, his need for constant food caused him to lose all the wealth of his family. All that was left to Erysichthon was his daughter Mestra, and he then promptly turned around and sold her to pay for more. But refusing to become a slave, Mestra ran to the seashore and begged Poseidon, who was possibly her first lover, to save her. Poseidon granted her the ability to shapeshift. Her new owner couldn't find her, and then gave up and left. But that was not the end of Mestra. Since her father now knew she could transform and escape, he began to sell her over and over again. He got money for food, and Mestra changed into a horse, a bird, a cow, a stag, all to escape a series of new masters. And so in this way, Mestra continued to allow her father to eat. But eventually, this scheme was not enough for his continually growing hunger. He began to eat himself. He gnawed his own flesh, and he tore his limbs and fed his body with everything he took from himself. And that was the end of Erysichthon. Ovid seems to have his own disturbing flourish to add to this myth. His story is similar to Callimachus's, the grove, the hunger making the king lose all his money and ending up a beggar. But of course, there's the whole additional part with Mestra, and then the self-cannibalism to end it all. But you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with Sisyphus and Autolycus? Well, stay with me, but let's have another look at the stories about Erysichthon. You might wonder where Ovid got the part about Mestra. Did he make it up? He seems to follow Callimachus at the beginning, but then he departs and things get a bit freaky. Well, Mestra's role is likely part of another version of this story, and a much older one at that. Ovid, of course, lived in the Roman period, but Mestra is mentioned in a source going all the way back to the days of Greece's Archaic period, centuries earlier. This story also appears in the 7th century BC poem, The Catalogue of Women. Traditionally, its author is said to be the poet Hesiod, but scholars today are pretty sure he didn't actually write it. Sadly, the work does not completely survive either. It's very fragmentary and hard to piece together. From what does survive, we can tell it gave the stories of many Greek heroes, and their mothers, wives, and daughters. The Mestra story is one of the more well-preserved sections. Scholars have reconstructed parts that suggest that Erysichthon is very hungry, that Mestra is the daughter of Erysichthon, that she had some kind of sexual relationship with the god Poseidon, that she can shapeshift, and that her father sells her into slavery in order to get money. These are all elements shared with Ovid's story of Erysichthon. But what's more is this. Scholars also see evidence in the Catalogue of Women of a fight between the father of Mestra and our legendary founder of Corinth, Sisyphus. So what's going on here? What does the trickster have to do with Mestra? Well, the reconstructions of the Catalogue of Women's Mestra myth paint this story, that Erysichthon was cursed with being eternally hungry. He would marry his daughter Mestra off to prospective grooms, to gain the bride price money that the grooms traditionally provided. Afterwards, Mestra would change shape and disappear, returning to her father to be sold, willingly or unwillingly, yet again. It's all a big elaborate con job. Sisyphus is one such victim. He intended to win Mestra from Erysichthon, so she could be married to his son Glaucus. But of course that did not happen. Sisyphus argued with the other king, probably wanting to get his money back since the marriage to his son Glaucus never happened. The two kings could not reach a conclusion. Erysichthon never negotiated in good faith after all. And the fragment suggests that they had to go to another authority to judge their situation. Possibly a god, but we don't know. It could have been another king as well. The judgment ended up going in favor of Erysichthon, the reason being that since Mestra did not get pregnant with Glaucus's children, the marriage was not consummated, and so never really occurred. In the end, the con ends anyway. The god Poseidon takes Mestra away for himself. He carries her to the island of Kos, and there she has a son who will one day go on to rule the island. And what of our other trickster, Autolycus? Returning to Ovid's story for a second, the Roman poet calls Mestra the wife of the trickster Autolycus. Perhaps we have another tradition here, or perhaps Autolycus is yet another one of the grooms tricked by Erysichthon and Mestra. It's an interesting idea that Mestra, Autolycus, Sisyphus, and Poseidon are all in one big love rectangle with each other. The most well-known myth featuring Sisyphus and Autolycus together shows them directly competing in a battle of wits. And this is why I placed them both in this episode together. Hyginus tells how, as a rich king, Sisyphus possessed a large number of cattle. In ancient Greece and many places in the ancient world, having a good herd of livestock was the best way to determine wealth. So Sisyphus prized his cattle and looked after them. But the king noticed his herds were slowly decreasing for an unexplained reason. There were no deaths or sickness, so he suspected theft. Sisyphus looked around at his neighbors and noticed that while his herds got smaller, the herds of Autolycus grew larger. He became convinced that Autolycus was behind it. In order to catch him, Sisyphus put a mark on the hooves of all his cows. When more went missing, he went to Autolycus. But Sisyphus ran into a problem. The poet Homer never says that Autolycus had special powers, only that he was a good thief and trickster, having been trained by Hermes. The later sources, Hyginus and Ovid, talk about his magic powers. Ovid's descriptions are more metaphorical, that he could make black white and white black. But Hyginus explicitly has Autolycus able to change stolen cows to a new color, or from a hornless animal to a horned one, or from horned to hornless. In this way, Hyginus has Autolycus almost outwit the wily Sisyphus. The son of Hermes tells the king of Corinth that he doesn't have any of Sisyphus's cows, since the animals look different. But Sisyphus simply bends over, and uses the secret marks he placed on his cow's hooves to catch Autolycus in the act. In some versions, Sisyphus placed his own name on his cow's hooves. In others, he wrote "stolen by Autolycus" on them. Sisyphus got Autolycus back in another way too. One of Autolycus's daughters was Anticlea. While Sisyphus was staying and trying to figure out the situation with the stolen cattle, he had some free time on his hands too, and he used that free time to seduce Anticlea. She was shortly after married to another man named Laertes, but she gave birth to a boy, a very famous hero called Odysseus. Both these men, Sisyphus and Laertes, are said to be the fathers of Odysseus in different literary sources. But with Sisyphus as the father, the families of this episode's two tricksters are joined together, and the hero that comes out of them is a clever trickster himself, and a hero of the later Trojan War. There is one more story about Sisyphus, and it's probably his most famous one. The myth about how Sisyphus avoided death was very popular among the ancient Greeks. The Athenian playwright Aeschylus even wrote a tragedy called Sisyphus the Runaway about it sometime in the 5th century BC. Unfortunately, that play is lost, but there are other sources of the story as well. The different versions all end the same way, with Sisyphus eventually being punished in the underworld. Homer's Odyssey, the oldest source for this story, written around the 8th century BC, does not give a reason for Sisyphus's punishment. It just describes it. Apollodorus's version, recorded several centuries later, says it was because Sisyphus went against the will of Zeus. The king of the universe, as per usual, wanted to seduce a girl named Aegina, who was the daughter of a river spirit named Asopus. So Zeus did what Zeus does best, grab Aegina in the form of an eagle and carry her away in his talons. With his daughter missing, Asopus began searching for her, and this is when Apollodorus says that Sisyphus, who apparently knew what Zeus had done, tells Asopus that it was Zeus who kidnapped his daughter. Presumably, for giving him up, Zeus struck Sisyphus with lightning, killing him, so he could be punished in the afterlife too. The 2nd century AD writer Pausanias agrees with Apollodorus on this reason for Sisyphus's punishment. But their roughly contemporary peer, Hyginus, disagrees. He says that Sisyphus was punished not because he ratted Zeus out, but because he was impious and cruel. Remember, Sisyphus had a habit of killing guests that came to his palace, and this was an offense particularly suited to get him on Zeus's bad side. But Hyginus and some quotes from the 5th century BC Greek philosopher Pherecydes tell of another very different circumstance about why Sisyphus was punished. It may have all started when Zeus kidnapped Aegina. Hyginus does not actually leave this part of the story out. He just gives it as yet another example of how Sisyphus went against the will of the gods. Regardless, the fallout from Sisyphus revealing Zeus as the kidnapper, or killing guests at his feasts, is this. Thanatos, whose name means death, is sent to Sisyphus. He is the literal god of death in Greek mythology, not the ruler of the dead like Hades. Thanatos is basically the Grim Reaper. He is going to pay Sisyphus a visit and bring death to him, ending the king of Corinth's life. But Sisyphus was waiting. He managed to trick Thanatos, bind him in chains, and keep him trapped. So Sisyphus saved himself. But by keeping Thanatos imprisoned, he also prevents death from going to any other human being. No one dies. This presents a problem. Hades notices the dwindling trickle of dead souls entering the underworld. He knows something is wrong. Thanatos can't be found anywhere. The ruler of the underworld complains to Zeus. The ruler of the universe intervenes by sending Ares to rescue Thanatos. Ares is successful. The death god is released, and Sisyphus is finally put into his clutches. The trickster finally dies. Or does he? Sisyphus himself was probably expecting that he couldn't keep Thanatos imprisoned forever. So before Ares arrived, the king of Corinth went to his wife and told her that when he died, she was not under any circumstances to perform the proper funerary rites and rituals an ancient Greek would normally have done for someone who died. And after Sisyphus does die, she followed his instructions. When Sisyphus is finally brought to the underworld, the inhabitants of Hades' domain realize that the rites were never done, and so the former king cannot technically continue into the afterlife. Sisyphus presents a solution. He tells Hades and Persephone that it was his biggest fear his wife would not properly take care of his funeral. He begs to return to Earth above so he can give his wife the right instructions. Hades finally agrees. Of course, that was all part of Sisyphus's plan. Once back on Earth, he decided to not return to the land of the dead, and he continued to live for many years with his loyal wife in Corinth. But even though his tricks were successful, Sisyphus was not immortal, and so he did eventually die, and could not escape his punishment forever. Homer gives the oldest and best description of it. He says Sisyphus was given an endless task of raising a stone with both his hands. With hands and feet he tried to roll it up to the top of a hill, but always, just before he could roll it over onto the other side, its weight would be too much for him, and the stone would come thundering down again onto the plains of Asphodel. Then he would slowly begin trying to push it up the hill again, and the sweat ran off of him and the steam rose from him. That brings us to the end of this episode. Sisyphus and Autolycus used their cleverness and deceit to find heroic glory. And of course, it got them both into a fair bit of trouble, too. Sisyphus is a founder figure in Greek mythology, being the legendary king that founds the city of Corinth. But both tricksters were also the founders of several family lines, sometimes even intertwining. In this way, other famous heroes of Greek mythology were descended from them. I will talk about those heroes in several future episodes when I cover their own adventures. Sisyphus was the father of Glaucus. Glaucus in turn was considered the human father of another Greek hero named Bellerophon. He goes on to have another descendant, also named Glaucus, who fights in the Trojan War. Two of Autolycus's daughters were Polymede and Anticlea. Polymede married Aeson, king of Iolcos. Their son was Jason, another famous Greek hero who was the captain of a ship of hero explorers, the Argonauts. And again, I already talked about Anticlea, who either by being seduced by Sisyphus or by being married to another man named Laertes, became the mother of another Trojan War hero, Odysseus. So Autolycus is both the grandfather of Jason and of Odysseus. Those specific relationships taken together don't actually make a lot of sense. While Jason and Odysseus are both grandsons, the two heroes are not usually put in the same generation of Greek heroes. Jason's adventures happened many years before the Trojan War involving Odysseus. This inconsistency in the timing is just a myth thing. It happens quite a bit. But just take it like this. Autolycus was an ancestor of these two Greek heroes. Whether he was grandfather, great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather is kind of beside the point. The takeaway is this. Through their descendants, Sisyphus and Autolycus are linked directly with several of the other heroes living in the interconnected and sometimes inconsistent Greek mythology universe. And that's all for today. If you're enjoying this podcast, I would appreciate it if you could give the pod a 5-star review and maybe share a comment on Apple Podcasts. As always, thank you for listening.